Hello, and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I am honored to have Barry Goldstein with me. Barry is a music producer and really a performer, and then in addition to that, he's the author of a book called The Secret Language of the Heart. And one thing I think you're going to find very interesting in Barry's story is how when you are passionate about something, and you need to reboot, sometimes you just have to go back to the drawing board. So, Barry, thanks so much for being on today.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Excited to talk to you today.
Yeah. So, growing up, talk a little bit about getting involved in the world of music. I know your dad ended up buying you a guitar under one premise that you had to make a promise to him. So, talk a little bit about, getting started and where the love of music came from.
Yeah, and I know your show's about things not always manifesting in that moment, and that's a great first starter because my dad bought me that guitar when I was literally 14 or 15 years old, and we couldn't afford the Gibson beautiful cherry sunburst guitar that he got me. We were going to buy a Fender Strat or a Telecaster, way over our heads monetarily. He was scared of my mom, who was literally like 4'5" old, and he took me aside and he said, "I'm going to buy you this guitar. I know your heroes play this guitar, Jimmy Page and Carlos Santana." And he said, "But I need you to make a commitment. I need you to make me a promise that you're going to stick with music." And of course, as a 14-year-old kid, I was all in, made the promise. Didn't realize at that moment that not only was I making a promise, but it was more of a rite of passage about what it meant as a man to make a promise and how that ripples out into the world. And, as I was moving through becoming a professional producer in my professional career later on, and having challenges living in New York City, coming up in the production world, I would look at that guitar and it would literally like have dollar signs, printed all over it as I was trying to meet my rent and everything else. And I would look at that guitar and I would just see the name of Les Paul on that guitar. And literally that name became a symbol of my dad's belief in me and of the quality, buying the better guitar, of how much he believed in me. And of course, I never sold the guitar. And 30 years after he bought me that guitar, through a series of synchronicities and persistence, I ended up working with Les Paul and ended up co-producing a Grammy Award-winning track with him for Best Rock Instrumental. And then I got to play with Les on stage. So it's a perfect example. It literally took 30 years for that to manifest, but when it did, it had such a profound effect because that Grammy Award actually, had a great impact on further things that I were to do, became a calling card, and it was all, started, and that intention rippling out from that promise.
I love that. Now, I want you to talk a little bit about that idea of the belief in you. And, I don't know where you were at in your music journey at that moment in time, but it sounds like your dad was willing to sacrifice quite a bit to give you, an opportunity with an amazing instrument to, find a passion or to continue a passion with that. And I think sometimes, for so many of us, we've had the blessing of someone being willing to speak life and excitement into something that we couldn't even necessarily see what the long-term trajectory was. So talk a little bit about that, for you at that moment in time and as you reflect on it.
Yeah, I think it was, with my family, the music was really kind of a mixed bag, because they did want to support me. They believed in music and playing an instrument, but they also came from the background of being brought up in the Depression years, and my dad literally came over from Poland. It took 10 years for his dad to get him over here, and they worked from a very young age. They didn't have a lot of money. There was a shortage of food in the country, and so they came from that belief that they education and having a steady livelihood was going to be the key to success. So music, although they believed in it as a hobby, they weren't fully behind it as a career. So the mantra that I grew up with was more of, it's a nice hobby, but what are you going to do for a living? you know, and till I was about 28 years old, I was chanting that mantra along with them as well, because obviously these ancestral patterns are passed along from generation to generation, and they have strong impact. And then I realized that music was something that was so inbred in me that I couldn't really do anything else. And I think when you have a passion, that's how you know, Phil,
Yeah.
that it's for you. When you cannot not do it. In other words, you don't have a choice, It's that you really have to do that. There's not an alternative because it just keeps coming back for you. And, music was that strong and that powerful for me. And I said, I have to believe in myself enough for it to move into a place where it's going to be successful. And that requires becoming an expert and a master of what you do and having that dedication. No matter what anybody else is saying, you're going to have that commitment to putting a certain number of hours in to develop the expertise that's necessary to rise and become the cream of the crop. And what was most interesting to me within that is that my parents had this enormous record collection, and they loved music. So they were avid music listeners. They loved Frank Sinatra. They loved Dean Martin. They loved listening to a diverse amount of music, and salsa and Celia Cruz. And, they would see the lifestyle of these artists, Frank Sinatra living in mansions, Dean Martin having his own show. And I was like, where do you think that money goes when you buy a record?
Right.
Look at the way that they're living and the success that they've had. But it was so beyond their belief system that someone could actually do what they love and do well with it, because it wasn't really part of their upbringing and their culture. So, we have the opportunity to move through, I'll call it lower vibrational, belief systems that our parents hand down to us, and decide whether we want to accept them ourselves. And this not only goes into careers, but it also goes into health and
Yeah.
health beliefs as well, like what we're capable of, how the epigenetic story is handed down to us as well within our frameworks, that we have the ability to move past at any time. And so it's not just, for people who do music or for arts. I'm sure that you were handed a deck with your family beliefs as well, and there's always challenges and beliefs we have to overcome to pave our own way.
100%. Now, something I want you to talk a little bit about, as you do venture into this as a career, is having belief in yourself to go do something, even though maybe there's people in your corner that don't support that decision at that moment in time. And I think for so many people, to your point, it may be a business, it might be a, whatever it is, but you're sitting there and you're saying, gosh, I just have such a passion behind this. Like, I know I can make it work. But to the outside, or to someone else who doesn't share that same passion, they go, it's a hobby, Barry. It's a hobby. Why are you pursuing it like it's a career or it's a lifelong opportunity? So talk a little about, starting and getting into that as a business.
Yeah, well, no one is going to believe in you if you don't believe in yourself.
Mm.
And that's the key. When you start, literally taking on the mentality of a racehorse, right,
Yeah.
and not looking to your sides or what other people are doing or what other people are saying, and there's only one path, and that's the path to the finish line, then it doesn't really matter, and that's really and once you start believing that strongly, other people go, wow, he's really doing this. Every success that you take on becomes part of the story
Yeah.
that you utilize to gain momentum in your career. And so all those little successes, you share those, with people who didn't believe. But also, I think you have to kind of keep things sometimes close to the chest when you're in creation mode, and keep it close to the heart, because that same racehorse who has the blinders on, if you share it with the wrong people who don't support what you do or have different belief systems, or they're bringing on their belief systems into your passion, it's very easy for them to shoot holes and the energy of whatever it is that you're doing. And literally, if you think of your vision and your mission as a balloon, right, and you keep blowing it up and blowing it up, every time you have a success, you're blowing it up even more and more. But if you blew it up a little bit and you told someone, hey, I'm doing this great song here, I want you to listen to it. And they're like, oh, that sounds good, but it sounds familiar. I heard someone who did something just like this. Right? And even though that's not a real, it's not a knockdown punch, but those little type of comments like that begin to take away from the momentum, and they poke little energy holes in whatever it is you're doing and start to deflate it, so you can't get the momentum to build up that balloon to a place where it's undeniable, right? And undeniable is where you really want to get before you're sharing your creative endeavors. Like, I view creation like a birth. And when you're going through a birth, you go through it in trimesters, and you hear a lot of mothers to be, well, I'm not going to share this yet with anyone because it's still fragile, and I want to make sure that it's grounded in, and we know that the birth is viable. And creation is really the same mechanism. In that first trimester where you're creating, you don't necessarily want to share that out yet. And this is just suggestions that I have for my process. This is not like a one-size-fits-all, because we all have different ways that we create. But when you feel good about a creation, whether it's a business plan, a proposal, it could be your next book, when you're getting to that point where you're like, man, this is it. You've gone through your own diligence. You've poked your own holes in it. Then you start to share it with people who can be trusted, your viable team that is going to support you, not guys who are going to be naysayers, but people who's like, hey, Phil, I got your back, man. I think this is a great idea. If you want feedback, I'll give you constructive criticism. If you don't, let me know. But either way, I'm going to be here to help you if you need it. That's the people you want on your team. You continue to birth it, and then you in your last trimester is when you're really getting to figure out how you want to share it and celebrate it in the world. And that's like, when that baby is due and you have a couple of months left, you're setting up the room, you're getting excited, you're figuring out the colors, you're getting prepared for the entrance into the world. So that's how I view it, and looking at bringing in support during the creative process along your way, when to do it, and it can be very valuable.
I love that. Now, for you, as you're in, we'll call it the first trimester of your business and getting started, you're in New York City, and you start in the pop music culture. So talk a bit about, getting started and being in New York City and, the early days.
Yeah, so for me, I grew up in the Bronx, which was a very diverse melting pot of music. And literally, before they were talking about playlists or music being healing, I'm just giving you like the groundwork and the seeds of why I went into the type of music I did initially, was because I was such around this melting pot of everything from hip hop and the beginning of rap music, right? Rapper's Delight came out when I was in high school, which was like literally the first rap song to ever break. And, we would share our mixtapes in the park. And we'd have our 30-minute cassette tapes. And I would see how each guy brought his own music into that to share his music. What that did when someone played, their music. Guys whose brothers were like warlords in gangs, or parents who were alcoholics, like watching them shift and watching their energy shift during their time to play their half-hour music, made me realize that how big of an impact music has on our mood and who we are in the world. And so with that melting pot of different types of music, that was my groundwork from going into the music business. Like, I didn't necessarily want to do one type of music. Yeah. I wanted to be open to doing lots of different kinds, and I did a lot of hip-hop, house music. I worked with major labels as well in terms of artists that were kind of coming up. I worked on compilation albums. I worked on remixes. Any way that I could get experience. And then I would go out to the clubs afterwards and literally experience and watch what the crowds were reacting to, how music was affecting them. and take that into the studio, which was kind of the, the experiment of, trying out different tracks, not just, listening and creating things, but always listening to how music was affecting people. And that was something that really continued to, regardless of what music I was doing. And even when I started getting more into healing music, that was something I took forward from those early days was, wow, these half-hour playlists that, we listened to in the Bronx could have this amazing effect on people. And also, you try something in the studio, and then you take it out and allow people to experience it and see how it affects people and see if you need to fine-tune and tweak things, and constantly going through that evolution of what was conceptual in the recording studio and the palette on the canvas of sound, and seeing what people was going to be beneficial for people in their listening process, whether it was in pop music or whether it was, in the healing, music journey. But eventually what happened, it's probably the next place you're going to go into, but I'll kind of fast forward and see if that's where you want to go, is that I got burnt out in the music business, and literally started losing my love for music. And, the healing aspects of music literally was an experiment on myself, because I didn't know that I wanted to go into music that was going to be helpful for, for navigating mood or for sleep. A matter of fact, if you would have told me that 40 years ago or 35 years ago when I was doing this, that my music would be putting people to sleep, that would have been like the biggest insult that you possibly could have given me. And now, with 75 million Americans alone, having sleeping problems in the world, I consider it probably the biggest compliment for someone to say, hey, I sleep with your music every night. That's a compliment. So that was the transition for me, was, me becoming the experiment on myself. And that moved into me doing healing music.
So when you talk about, the healing music, there's, the idea that you were mentioning earlier of like when people listen to music, they can change, right? And it can cause, a feeling within them or maybe a memory within them, right, from that music itself. But then you've taken it a step deeper, well, multiple steps deeper, but one of the steps deeper is actually just, the beats per minute and how that syncs within, the body and how it's operating. So talk a little about the science behind the music and how it works within the body.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of science and spirituality kind of intersecting, as well as modern and ancient also intersecting. And that's really the sweet spot of what's been, involved in my career. But ultimately, when I knew that I wanted to reconnect with music, the first thing I thought about was, well, if I'm going to reconnect with music, I have to feel something in my heart. And, knowing that feeling that I got when my dad bought me the guitar, when I was, that kid and a teenager sitting on the edge of his bed, holding this guitar and writing songs, the first thing that I did as soon as I learned 3 chords on a guitar was write songs. And remembering the excitement and the happiness of birthing something from nothing, and that song wasn't in the world like yesterday. And now this is something that is actually in the physical, it's something that could be sung. And I knew that I wanted to reconnect with the power of birthing something into the world again, not just doing music as a job and having to meet deadlines and timelines of, creating a 4-minute song and spending 60 hours in the week to create that 4-minute song. I'm like, there's got to be something more than this. And I think that happens for a lot of us. Like, we have this picture in our head of our ideal career, and we move to a place where it happens in the physical. You get into that job, you're successful at it, but then there's something missing from what was the original mission or vision behind it.
Yeah.
And for me, that was about touching people, you know, it was about people being moved by a song, and something that just moved you ripples out to move someone else. So when I did my first search online, and I put in music and the heart, and what came up was that music at 60 beats per minute can move the heart to a relaxed state, because the heart at a relaxed state is between 60 to 70 beats per minute. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I knew what beats per minute were because I was involved with DJs who constantly are looking at beats per minute. I said, like, what would happen if I set my metronome to 60 beats per minute and just allowed myself to start to take these journeys where it was really the opposite of my process at that point, going from very minute, structured compositions to, instead of composing music, decomposing to it.
Yeah.
And I wonder what would happen. And so I just started taking these journeys at 60 beats per minute. And what I found was I was going into these really deep states of trance. You know, I didn't even know what to call it at that point, you know, moving to a meditative state, or in training, or moving to heart coherence, weren't really within the language that I was speaking at the time. But I knew when I would listen back to these pieces, wow, there's something here that's very relaxing. And then I would add other layers on top of that. And the key was that I really, because it was never written out, I didn't know what was coming at me. And I had to use intuition musically to, you know, create the next layers of whatever the composition was. And that created some really interesting melodies and harmonics that people were later calling like the music of the spheres, you know, or or this is music for alpha brain state, or whatever their dialogue was. And I knew, because it had an effect on me, that it might have effect on other people. And that's when I started kind of playing it for other people and looking more into the mechanisms of why it was working, and beginning to research it more. But it ended up being a 6-album series. I was going to say CD, but most people won't know what I'm talking about. So, which I named ambiology, which was a word that I made up, where ambi stood for really the place of beauty or serenity, and how that affects our biology. And I remember at the time, like, looking that up online, and there was nothing that came up in search at that point. Now, if you type in ambiology, there's a slew of things that come up with that, and people just started sharing their successes with me. You know, their parents, or a parent who had dementia, who, you know, was using it to get to sleep at night, or using it in a dental office, or people birthing children into the world with these albums. And that's, you know, started rippling out more, me sharing it with more people, led to me writing a book about it later on. But that was the initial seed that was planted, was based on me being able to let go enough to move to a meditative state, and then realizing, as I was doing it more and more, that something's going on here. I'm not just connecting to what I know, but it feels like I'm connecting to something, and something that's unknown.
Yeah.
And at the time, you know, I considered myself agnostic, and but was going through this awakening of feeling connected to something beyond myself, and wasn't really calling it anything at that time, but it felt like I was connecting to something much bigger, you know, to the universe, or now you know, the field. You know, it's as I work with guys like Dr. Joe Dispenza and other spiritual leaders, they started to define it in different ways that I had never heard before. The quantum, you know, all of these things. Yeah. But what I realized was I was connecting and collaborating with what I knew and what I didn't know. And that's really what became powerful for me, is not just knowing that I was connecting with it, but beginning to invite that in to my process with intention. And bringing intention into the recipe of creating this music was a big part of it.
Yeah. Now, I want to get into that in a second, but before we do, to tie in something you were talking about earlier where, people will deflate the idea if you let them in too early. If I recall correctly, originally people said, well, they're not going to listen to an hour long tape, or
Well,
that's
I
just
said
too.
that.
Oh, you said that.
Yeah,
But then
I
people
said that.
killed
Yeah,
their
I mean that was
presence.
that was me, in my head, saying no one's, because of my background, no one's going
Yeah.
to listen to an hour-long piece of music with virtually no melody
Yeah.
and nothing that they could hum along to. And that's why initially I really didn't, it was for my own healing process. I really didn't share it with that many people, but it was having such a profound effect on me. And at the time, I was dating a massage therapist, and
Yeah.
she heard what I was doing.
Yeah.
And she's like, wow, can I use this in my practice? And I said, yes. And she said, oh my God, people love this music because at the time, most of the new age music that was coming out, most of it had like sounds of birds or like the ocean. And, those things can become markers
Yeah.
in the mental system as well. So, hearing the ocean at 5 minutes into the piece, right, or a bird chirping, if it's something that you don't like, you're placing a mental marker there and moving into the analytical mind.
Mm.
And when that judgment comes in, you're automatically out of what we call the zone, which is
Yeah.
that sweet spot, like where you're moving into these alpha and theta states, these deep states of relaxation and flow states as well. You don't want to move into the analytical mind. And so she said, this is great because no matter where I am in the piece, I don't know where I am as a massage therapist. I can play it over and over again for my clients that come in, and they never really have an experience where they're moving into the analytical or into that judgmental mind. And that allows me to do the work that I'm doing because the music's taking them into the parasympathetic state, which is that's the state where we are relaxed, we're resting, we're digesting, we're rejuvenating. Our immune system is enhanced in that state, and it's really us with our guards down. When you're in the opposite state called the sympathetic state, is when we're like running from the bear, so to
Mm.
speak, when we have timelines and deadlines and, stress in our lives. The parasympathetic is when we feel safe enough to let go and let our guard down and just receive. And she said, that's where I want my clients to be in a massage because it's going to have a lot more impact on their physical body if they can be in that state. So yeah, it was initially me saying, well, no one's going to listen to this. And the perfect example of how wrong I was.
Yeah.
But also, I think because I didn't really have a, um, a a really tie to it where I felt like, oh, this has to succeed,
Yes.
or didn't. It was very loose, and I didn't have a lot of, things, pressures on myself for it to succeed. So therefore, I let it out into the world in a very pure sense. Like whoever can use this and heal from it, I'm open to that, and even not defining what that healing looked like for them, whether it's just feeling, emotionally better or relaxed, or it didn't really have a whole lot of definition. And that's, I think a lot of times when we're birthing new things into the world, we have stringent definitions of what we want that to look like. And then when that doesn't occur, we label it as not a success or even a failure,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of times it's ripples in the world in ways that we don't even know. Like think
Yep.
about the people that you've helped, through your podcast, right? And bringing awareness in through bringing in great speakers and asking great questions, and from your commitment to wanting to share this with your audience, how many people are touched by that you never hear about, right? I mean, you
Yep.
only hear a few people who might give you a compliment.
Yeah.
A lot of times we hear more people complaining about it, right? But there are a lot of people being touched by what you do who you never know about. And if we knew that, we probably wouldn't be that hard on ourselves, because I have many experiences in my life where something I thought wasn't a real successful release on an album, and then people coming up to me years later and say, I played that at my mom's funeral, or I played that for my dad when he was passing, like in 5 years after. I was like, I found out,
Yeah.
or an album that I created 10 years prior, like the first album I played for Dr. Joe
Yeah.
was an album, one of those things. It's like, yeah, it had a decent amount of exposure, but there was this one piece that he loved. And when I gave him that album a year later, he said, wow, I love this piece, Ambiology 5 Eden. And that became one of the pieces that he used in the early meditations we worked together, and rippled out to a lot of future collaborations from that one release. But that was like the initial one. If I would have looked at the amount of streams or sales that had, I would have never thought 10 years prior that it would have rippled out to help so many people. So we just never know.
I love that. Now, to your point, you and Dr. Joe Dispenza have done work together, and talk a little bit about how that relationship came to be, and then how kind of the collaboration got started.
Yeah. Well, I saw What the Bleep like a lot of people. A lot of people hear about Dr. Joe through the meditations and through the live events, now, because he's definitely reached like that tipping point where there's a lot of awareness around. But in those earlier days, there was a movie he was in called What the Bleep Do We Know? And a lot of people that are in the field that were back then, were in this movie, What the Bleep, and it literally looked at quantum science and broke it down to what we know and what we don't know. And out of all the people in the film, I remember seeing it. For some reason, Dr. Joe really like resonated with his the way that he broke it down, and intention, and how that ripples out into our lives. It was in such a beautifully simplistic way, but it was also in a very East Coast way. He's from New Jersey. I was
Yeah.
from New York. I'm like, who is this guy? This guy like wasn't like the other people that I was used to seeing in those roles.
Yeah.
Like more of, I don't want to say hippies or be have stereotypes about people, but it was kind of like that back then. So
Yeah.
seeing him speak about it that way, and in a way that I really understood, I was like, wow, I really like this guy. I want to see what he's about. So later on, and as I started doing more of this music, and also speaking at conferences as well about this, Dr. Joe was at one of the same events that I was at, and I had just done a album with Monroe Institute, who were the pioneers of a technology called HemiSync, that one of the first really companies that were using binaural beats with music. And they've been doing
Wow.
it now for over 50 years. So I had this release I had just done that was geared towards heart entrainment and brain entrainment. It was called Wisdom of the Heart. And I knew he was going to be there, so I gave him this album. And he took the album and said, great, I'll take a listen to it. And he did. And a year later, we were at the same conference, and he literally had his assistant hunt me down so that he could talk to me. And he said, I've been using this album with my advanced students for
Wow.
like a whole year, and I haven't experienced anything that's taken them into coherent alpha brainwave states as eloquently as this music. He said, I'd love to talk to you more about
Wow.
collaborating with you. And that's really where it started, in terms of me, um, providing music for the meditations, but also playing live at events. Initially, for the first 5 years, I was playing live at events where we were creating the meditations in the moment based on the group energy, and keep creating these coherent states,
Wow.
um, from something to nothing, as we say.
That's amazing. Now, in addition, you end up writing your book, and The Secret Language of the Heart. Talk a little bit about, the reason behind the book, and then maybe some of the great takeaways that you had while writing the book.
Well, what I realized was that like writing a book about music is much different than writing music.
That's a good realization.
Yeah, that was a really big realization. But I mean, in some ways, I can be a perfectionist, and what writing the book made me realize was that all of these things that were in the book were things I had been doing and sharing with audiences, for 10 to 15 years prior before the book, and bringing the book out was bringing it into physical manifestation. But when you're writing a book, it really tests your belief systems. Like, what are you willing to now put in writing? Because it becomes part of history,
Yeah.
and you better make sure that you really mean it, and that that you believe in what you're saying, whether other people do or don't. And so that was a great part of the process. But what inspired it really is that I wanted this to book to move into areas where at the time, sound healing wasn't a second, like second nature. Like I wanted to share it more in the medical world.
Yeah.
And so I knew that I wanted to have more science behind how certain sound healing techniques or methodologies that I was using, how they can be connected to science. And at the same time, I had met my wife, who's a naturopathic medical doctor and a researcher. And, we really kind of like delved into some of that together as well. Like, what do you really want to share with the audiences? Because if we want to take this book into medical conferences in different areas, what is it that you want to show? And that really made me think like, wow, I would really like, I don't want to go into medical conferences and just reiterate what other people have done before. Like, I would really love to break ground and take people out of their comfort zone. And knowing that like things like chanting Om would probably not be a doctor's comfort zone,
Yeah.
or taking them into placing their hands on their hearts, in front of colleagues. And so I was like, those are the things that I want to show have validity, and not only in the subjective mind, or the emotional areas, but there are objective findings how this affects our physical body as well as the mental, emotional, and spiritual. So that's where the research kind of led,
Yeah.
and finding studies on how Om can create what's called limbic deactivation. So when our limbic system is deactivated, we experience more inner peace and a sense of calm. And able to find studies of showing that when people chanted the sound of S, that nothing happened through viewing fMRI studies, but when they chanted Om, that it actually lit up areas of the brain that were associated with inner peace. So when I was sharing this with doctors and sharing that information, then asking them, "Are you willing to now, experience this as a group together?" And having them stand up and chant the chant I created called Om Shalom Home, and watching 200 to 300 doctors standing up and chanting made me realize that the language of science is important in this process of bringing these teachings into mainstream, because it enables them to feel safer, and knowing that there was some science behind it and fMRIs behind it and things like that, they didn't feel as conscious about standing up and chanting, with their colleagues. So it really became a way to reach more mainstream audiences and really move beyond preaching to the choir. And I
Yeah.
think that's where we are now. Like, almost, it's 9 years after my book was released, but over
Yes.
10 since I started writing it. You know, they're becoming more commonly used terms: heart coherence, brain coherence, entrainment, neurofeedback, all these
Yeah.
things that were, being used then, but were much harder to introduce into more corporate or medical type environments, it's a lot easier now. Like sound, people are getting into sound healing now,
Yeah.
have it a lot easier. Because
Yeah.
there's a lot more research, a much larger body of research that can be pulled from than there was 10 years ago.
So to that point, I think anytime you're pioneering something, you're gonna have a lot of people that say, "What is this guy talking about? What this isn't real, right?" That they're the more naysayers, and once again, kind of coming back to like what you had mentioned earlier, like but I believed in it, right? Like I had seen the benefits of it. And
Right.
so talk about continuing on a path when you've seen the benefits, you have the belief, even if the outside group is naysaying towards, what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think it's a balance, and finding a balance of how you do that. Yeah, you want to share it, but if people are not open to it, you're not going to share it with them anyway. So
Yeah.
learning the effect of linguistics and knowing that music's a bridge and meeting people where they're at is really important. And just to also clarify, there were people before me doing this as well. There were pioneers before me doing this, and this has been something that's been done for thousands of years. So I'm not pioneering, playing singing bowls or drumming, or any of the ancient methodologies. If it's anything, it's more about being passionate about this being shared in the world and being a voice for it to come forward. But ultimately, you have to ask yourself, and this is with anything, like who's your audience? You have
Mm.
to know
Yeah.
your audience. Like who's listening to this podcast, and it
Yep.
might some of the things I'm talking about might be foreign to them. In terms of if they're used to more business oriented things, or more geared towards entrepreneurship. But I will tell you that all of these, I dance in all these worlds. I'm a part of a lot
Yeah.
of entrepreneur groups. All the methodologies that I'm talking about with using music for managing anxiety, for using music to sleep at night, for using music to gain focus, have a lot of science behind it. And not only that, it's what I call acousticeuticals.
Mm.
So there are low cost, non invasive ways to utilize these things to shift your mood without any really addictive, anything that's going to be addictive in a negative way.
Yeah.
You might get addicted to listening to your favorite song, but obviously, that's going to be more of a positive than a negative. But it is knowing your audience. If
Yeah.
I'm talking and have a corporate workshop, for AT&T or for Amex, I might not want to be calling, the centers chakras. You know,
Mm. Yeah.
maybe I just want to talk about where you're holding stress in your physical body
Mm.
and meet them where they're at. Okay, they understand that breath can help us release stress. Okay,
Yeah.
well then let's place our hands, let's put it on the base of our spine just so we have a place to send our breath to. And let's just use the breath as a way to release any stress you're holding in your physical body. Give yourself a big breath in. And just because we want to release a sound, just release a big right from that place. And let's do that a couple of times until you start feeling a little bit lighter in that area.
Yeah.
So that's how I might talk about that in a corporate environment. Now, if I go to, if I go to a wellness and healing seminar or summit, I probably don't want to just talk about releasing stress because they're like, wow, this guy's like really, really corporate. Why are we just like talking about releasing stress? Doesn't he know how powerful music is? That we
Yeah.
have energy centers and chakras like within those same places that are like wheels of light and sound that are ancient rites of passage. Each time we like breathe into one of them, it's a rite of passage, and each of those areas holds emotional energy that is
Mm.
geared towards specific things that come into our lives, from feeling safe and nurtured in our base chakra to using our throat chakra to expressing our truth and our purpose, right?
Wow.
I mean,
Yeah.
completely different ways of expressing it. But it's really the same thing. So you have to know your audience and know what's going to create an opening for them. And ultimately, it's not about prescribing and saying, no, this is going to create healing in you when you do this. It's about creating curiosity is much more important than creating healing. Because if you can create a curiosity where someone's like, wow, I felt like energy move in that area, or something happened. I felt like a tingling sensation, or that's really weird. Like I had lower back pain this whole week. And when I release stress in that area, this is the first time that I haven't experienced pain like in a week. What the hell just happened there? Right?
Yeah.
Did I just meditate? Or
Yeah.
did I just do something that I'm not aware of? And if you can create something where there's curiosity and they're like they walk away from that event and start researching on their own, like, wow, I want to see what breath work is more about, or I want to, what is this like sound medicine or sound healing about, or music as medicine. Now you've created an opening for them to really set boundaries with their own journey, you know?
Yeah.
Because either one of those, if I had voiced it the way that I wanted to, it might not have sounded that way. So I think that's really an important dynamic, not just in working with sound and music, but really anything. Like, who's your audience and how can you meet them where they're at? Because if you just walk in with an agenda of like, these are my hot topics, these are my talk points that I need to get across, right? And this is what I'm going to be selling. You know, I get it. I understand it. You know, money is energy, and you know, all of that. That you know, we want to see success in things that we're doing, but ultimately, curiosity is probably the highest selling point you can give them by inviting them into your community, and knowing that having them as what I call a tribe member that's ongoing is going to eventually going to turn into some other type of energy. You know, whether it is them as a client or them recommending people to you, where people are experiencing your work that you're getting paid for, it's going to ripple out.
Yeah.
But you have to basically welcome them in to what you do first. And if they feel alienated because they had this great experience and then you had to upsell them at the end and they didn't resonate with that, you again, who's your audience? You know,
Yeah.
what are you doing when you're coming into the space?
I love it. Barry, I could talk to you for hours, but I know we've only got so much time. I'll end you with this question here. You know, you've won a Grammy, you've authored a book, you've produced multiple albums, very well accomplished things, but what brings you the most fulfillment in what you get to do?
The thing that brings me the most fulfillment is really the creative process, you know, of moving into that flow state and
Yeah.
birthing something from nothing. Like, I don't think there's anything more powerful than that, you know, and this does move into spiritual philosophies as well, you know, in terms of if you believe in something beyond yourself, whatever you want to call it, whether you call it the universe or you call it God, you call it Christ consciousness, you call it Buddha, it doesn't really matter. But if you believe that there is a creator and there's a creative energy to everything around us, like look at flowers, look at, you know, the ocean, look at all these amazing colors and these amazing things that are constantly around us, that you're tapping into that energy of creation on a larger scale when you take a walk in nature,
Yeah.
when you know you are listening to the wind, whatever it is that you're tapping into that creative energy. For me, there's nothing more powerful than creation, because when you're doing that, you're tapping into that energy, and there are no limitations when you're in that state. You know, people talk about hitting flow state. When you're connecting with this unlimited field of all potentials, there is no answer no. You know, it's always a yes. And for me, that's what brings me the most joy, is being in that creative state and then watching that ripple out. And that's what we call resonance. So, you know, when I create a piece of music, it literally has a life of its own. it reaches out to an audience where people listen to it and they say, wow, I love that piece. When they're doing that, that's called resonance. Something in them is the music is reacting to it in some way, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual. And what happens is that piece of music takes on a field of its own. So it's carrying my intention, it's carrying the harmonics, it's carrying the melodies I wrote, but it grows with every person that listens to it. That thing that started with me takes on a life of its own where people are using it to create in their lives with it, or they're using it to create better sleep, or they're doing it to feel create more self-love within themselves. So that one piece of music that started in here, in this room, went on to ripple out into the world in a much more powerful way. And as long as I can continue to do that, then I'm good.
I love it. Well, Barry, I want to say thanks so much for sharing your journey and all the amazing work that you're doing. Folks, go get his book. Check out his different albums. You can find his music just about anywhere that a person would listen to music. But Barry, thanks so much, and excited to continue to watch your journey. And we'll have to do this again here in 2 or 3 years and see all the new things that you're working on then.
That sounds great, Phil. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for finding me, and thank your audience for listening to me and all you're doing in the world as well.